Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Kelly Dowling. I am Senior Manager of Enterprise Content here at ASUG, and I'm so excited to be back with all of you, and I'm pleased to welcome back Martin Barkman, who's the Senior Vice President and Global Head of Solution Management for Digital Supply Chain at SAP, and Justin Goldston, who is Professor of Project and Supply Chain Management for Penn State University. They're here to answer some questions about the topics being shared today. So make sure you drop any questions that you may have into the chat. But gentlemen, welcome. Thank you so much for jumping on for this conversation for the next 15 minutes or so.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Great. I hope you both have enjoyed the conference so far. Great sessions presented by both of you. We want to make sure that we touch on some of the topics that you've been touching on and also get to some additional questions from the audience. But I want to kick off, I mentioned at the beginning of the conference a statistic that came out of our 2021 State of the SAP Supply Chain Customer Study that mentioned that the number one thing that customers are thinking about for 2021 is how they can improve their supply chain transparency. Now, 86% of those respondents indicated that they expected data and dashboarding to have the greatest impact in order to do this. So I'd love to hear from each of you. What are your thoughts on this? Do you agree that these are the areas that customers should be focusing on in order to improve their supply chains? And Martin, maybe I'll start with you and see what your thoughts are. And then Justin, we'd love to hear from you next.
Absolutely. And the statistic does not surprise me. And let me give an example, right? So in supply chain, a lot of times there would be discussion that supply chain management is all about making the right product at the right place, at the right time, at the right cost, and the right quantity, etc. And I think back then there was this continuous chasing of the last dollar that could be squeezed out of the supply chain. And I think it's different now. Certainly cost is one element when you're thinking about setting up a supply chain, but you have to think about resilience, which we talked about earlier. You have to think about the risk that whatever design is chosen has. You have to think about, is that supply chain not just low cost, but ultimately one that's going to drive the aspirations of the customers that you serve. You have to think about the sustainability impact. So the question is, how do you do that without data, without information rendered in easy-to-use dashboards? I think it'd be very tough. So I agree with that statistic. It does not surprise me, and I think it's going to be quite relevant for supply chain leaders going forward.
Great. Yeah, and Justin, I know we were talking about this shortly before, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I would say in terms of data, I would say data is going to be the critical success factor of supply chain resilience and the future state of the supply chain practice. I spoke briefly about sustainability in my talk. I did also mention that I'm writing a book called AI for Good, where we're going to talk about how we're going to leverage artificial intelligence. I call it augmented intelligence. So AI, how we're going to leverage AI to address all 17 UN SDGs. And from an organizational perspective, in order to meet the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals, we're going to need data from organizations. There are a number of different objectives that have to be met, and the only way in order to meet some of those objectives is to receive data from organizations. So organizations have just as much of a contribution as the governments of the world, as much a contribution as what I refer to as a citizen scientist. So citizen scientist is where I refer to individuals, every single one of us. We can be scientists, regardless of your training, regardless of your education. You can collect data to make a positive contribution on the world. You can collect data, right? Organizations can share their data. And from a sustainability perspective, and I say sustainability all begins with supply chain management. And in order to meet those goals, we have to collect the data from the supply chain. So data is going to be very important for our future.
Right. Yeah, and Martin, you talked about sustainability as one of those kind of four pillars that SAP is focusing on related to supply chain management. And I know that we had a question that we wanted to pose back to you. Do you see a shift away from lean principles such as just in time? So can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting concept. I mean, to say that something completely will disappear is not fair. But the concept of just in time was based on certain preconditions, certain things that we could take for granted, and now it's much more complex. And whatever we were able to take for granted may be something that actually has an inherent risk with it, right? So availability of transportation, availability of materials. Now, of course, we can solve for that. I think the other thing we take for granted is that whatever we do in the supply chain isn't necessarily connected to the customer. So as customers become more demanding and want products here and now or very, very quickly, if the supply chain was optimized for leanness exclusively, it is possible that that actually compromises what customers ultimately are seeing in terms of availability. So I think there are more dimensions now than just one simple tool such as just in time. But of course, lean principles are still relevant. And I think there's more that has to be solved for now because the supply chain is not just a back office function. It really is something that can differentiate companies and how they go to market.
Yeah, absolutely. And Martin, I know that, within your role, you're kind of leading the overall supply chain management portfolio. So to kind of speak to this idea that it's not just back office functions anymore, that it really has to be driven by technology. When you think about what SAP is doing to help enable customers in this space, what are you kind of most excited about for 2021 and beyond?
Yeah, no, I think one topic area that's super cool, and I mentioned it briefly in my talk earlier, is this idea of the digital twin and the digital thread. And the digital twin concept, I mean, it started by being just specific to a given asset sitting somewhere. But you can extend that to the entire supply chain and have a digital rendering where what's happening in the supply chain in the real world is represented in this digital rendering. And then you can also control it, right? So it's a bi-directional flow of information. If you then layer in the concept of the digital thread, which is how does that information, how did the supply chain arrive at that state? And the path it took can have an impact on where you ultimately want to go, right? So Bayesian type of thinking. I think we're just starting to scratch the surface on this. But if you apply that type of statistics and that type of analytics, then all of a sudden you can leverage this digital thread and understand what has happened to the supply chain and in which sequence did it happen to make even more interesting predictions about what's going to happen. So this to me is really, really exciting stuff. It's kind of the combination of the basics of supply chain management and some pretty interesting mathematics and computational elements from other fields that are now being brought into supply chain.
Sure. And that all goes back to the data, right? In order to be predictive and making decisions based off that, you have to be able to analyze the data. So I think that goes back to the statistic we heard earlier. Justin, I saw you nodding your head and smiling during some of what Martin was saying. So I feel like you have something to add there.
Martin just got me very excited just then because the digital twins and digital threads is one thing we're actually researching within higher education, and exactly to your point, we're integrating digital twins within supply chain courses because we're saying that digital twins can contribute to these lean principles. It's reducing waste. Right. So for new product designs, we can use digital twins, right? And we can reduce waste throughout our supply chains. We can use digital twins for sustainable practices because now we're not including additional wasteful product throughout our supply chains. So whenever you mention that, that's why I got excited. I geek out a lot, but yeah, I geek out on that one. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Justin, I know you talked a lot about sustainability and you just mentioned it again. And without going too deep into this, I mean, I think the Suez Canal situation was a great example of what happens when, you're not putting all the effort behind your supply chain. And so knowing kind of what, Martin, you are within the SAP realm specifically and looking at SAP technology, and Justin, you're kind of more in a broader role looking at supply chain and sustainability. I'd love to hear from you, Justin, in terms of thinking about supply chain with technology, irrespective of technology. What are the things that you're kind of advising your students on as far as what they really need to be paying attention to in order to make sure they're not making the same mistakes that happened with the Suez Canal and to make sure that they're becoming more sustainable moving forward?
I would say the one thing I tell people is, you have to first begin. You first have to understand the broad spectrum of supply chain management. Because whenever students say, "Oh, I want to be supply chain manager," I say, "Do you know how large the supply chain practice is?" I say, just understand it from a broad perspective, and then kind of like I say, just like job rotational programs. Try to immerse yourself into purchasing, into forecasting, into planning, into ERP applications, and then you'll figure out what area you want to be in. But going back to the Suez Canal example, I had an interesting discussion. So I had Joe Henwood. Joe Henwood's the vice president of omnichannel at Levi's. He actually came and spoke with one of my classes at Penn State, and that was one of the questions that came up because he speaks a lot about blockchain. He speaks a lot about AI, and and one of the students said, "How could we use AI to prevent the Suez Canal?" Yes, we have supply chain disruptions, but we don't have data for the machine to learn about what happened with the Suez Canal. So you have those outliers. You have the Suez Canal debacle. I call it Suez Canal debacle. You have the event with the pandemic. Those things we have data now, but before then we don't have. So there's going to be disruptions like this that are going to continue to emerge. All you can do is mitigate with the data you have, right? And one thing that I do get some kickback on within the industry is, let's share the data. We're here for a common goal. That's where sustainability comes in. We all have to work together to continue to operate. Like I said in my presentation, whenever we operate business as usual and we always have this profitability focus, we have the situation like we had in the pandemic. Now everyone suffers.
Yeah.
If we work together as a collective, I think that we'll be in a better space. And that's one thing that I'm talking about now and I'm trying to back it up in research in terms of the sharing economy. I think I have a big task on my hands, but hey, you got to start somewhere.
Yeah. Yes, and that's a great point. There might be another, whether it's a Suez Canal or another pandemic, it might look different, but there's definitely going to be disruption. There's going to be unprecedented events and other things that happen socially, economically, that come up that impact how customers are able to run their businesses. And Martin, this was kind of a focus with your keynote this morning, talking about how you can examine the role of a resilient supply chain in order to respond to and recover from those unanticipated events. So when you think about whatever the next unanticipated event is, what should companies be considering? What should customers be considering right now in order to get in front of being able to be resilient and adapt to whatever that might be?
Yeah, I mean, something that hasn't been necessarily talked about as much is doing a real stress testing a system, right? Simulating a major catastrophe, whatever that is. I mean, we do it with safety procedures. We do it with security related threats. Why not do it with a supply chain shock and let the powers that be in a company and all the people simulate? Let's look for a major. It could be a weather disaster. How would we, if it's truly one that is a complete surprise, how would we react during the disaster, and then how quickly could we return to where we were after the main part of the disaster is mitigated. And I think doing that, bringing everybody together and it'll force an assessment of what's missing, what's pretty good, and what is world class in terms of processes and systems. I think doing it, stepping away from the daily course of business just a little bit and allowing something like that to take place could be an interesting differentiator for a company.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you think about that, especially with SAP technology, there's this whole phase of testing, right? You go through these stages of testing the product and the technology, and maybe there's a little bit of downtime, but it's worth it in the end because you're understanding what might happen later on. So I think that's a great point to consider, that how you get in front of a debacle, like you said, Justin, is to prepare yourself for it. So great insights from both of you there. We only have about a minute left, but I do want to ask one question. It's great to connect virtually. We were just talking about this before, but eventually, hopefully, we can be in person again. So what are you both looking forward to most about when you can go back to an in-person ASUG supply chain conference?
I just say the face-to-face collaboration. I mean, like I said, I think that we've all had this Zoom complex, and we've kind of lost that true collaboration. Yes, we've done the best we can, but there's nothing like that face-to-face collaboration and discussion and relationship. So I'm just looking for the face-to-face. Just, you understand how important shaking hands is going to be once we return?
It's been a while.
That's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, from my side, same thing. We did a little team exercise during the pandemic where we all shared either our greatest memories or the biggest coincidences that we had experienced in our lives. And what was interesting is almost all the answers occurred while traveling, while being outside of our regular areas of work. And if I think back, this last year and a half of working remotely, the work-related memories are fewer than before. So I'm looking forward to getting out there and making lasting memories together with other people.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I will remember this conversation because I enjoy this, and I hope that you both do as well. But until we can go back to in person, we appreciate both of you being here to answer questions virtually. I know how much the ASUG community appreciates that. So thank you both for taking a few minutes out of the agenda today to answer some additional questions. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And for those that are ready to jump into their next session, we have our next couple rounds of breakout sessions on the agenda. So make sure you click on the agenda page to see what else you can tune into. I will be back with all of you at the end of the day for our final keynote session. So thank you so much.